Welcome to this getting started video on Saxon with Dive Math 5.4 through 8.7. Thank you for purchasing this course. And first up, I want to talk about how to complete a lesson. We're just going to dive right in and we're going to look at the 4 steps of completing a lesson. So those 4 parts of a lesson, when we talk about a lesson, we're talking about the Dive lecture, that's first, and then the Saxon facts practice, the Saxon lesson practice, and then the Saxon mixed practice. The Dive course, that's lectures, video lectures that teach the Saxon textbook, teach the lessons in the Saxon textbook. And so step 1 is to watch the lecture. Watch every lecture. It's important to understand that the Saxon textbook, the lesson in there is only a summary of the complete lesson, and John Saxon himself, he recommended an experienced teacher to teach his courses. So in the Dive lectures, that's what I do. I try to include the missing connections that are between the lessons, helping you see, oh, this lesson connected to that one, and so on. That's really important in a course like Saxon where it's incremental, it builds in bite-sized pieces. And also my experience teaching this course, I kind of know where students struggle, and I'll add additional instruction that's not in the textbook in those places. So don't think you have to read the book and watch the lecture. Watch the lecture. You can skip the textbook for now. Plus, math is something that you do. It's not a passive thing to watch, but you see someone else do it in a video lecture. You see things come up line by line, number by number. Then you do them yourself. Usually you connect with that idea a little faster than just passively reading. So that complete lesson is presented during the lecture, the complete lesson from the Saxon textbook. And a textbook lesson may have several parts, and you'll see them come up in bite-sized pieces basically in the video lecture. It's just a little less intimidating to look at one piece at a time instead of opening the textbook and seeing all those pages and numbers and letters everywhere. And again, there's additional instruction that you'll learn about that the textbook doesn't have. So the lecture, you'll watch that, you'll take brief notes. And so that means you want to include things like headings, like it's lesson 120, and subheadings, volume of a cylinder. But you don't have to write that whole thing out. You can just do it short, volume, period of cylinder. And shorthand is what that's called sometimes, abbreviated. You also want to include key points, just key ideas, problem-solving tips that you hear or that you see come up. A word problem, for example, you don't have to write the whole sentence or sentences out for that again. Formulas, like this one here, you'd want to include things like that. And a great thing about the lecture, as opposed to being in a live class, is that you can pause and rewind it anytime you need to listen to something again. That's one of the beauties of having a lecture like this, is that you can go at your own pace. And again, you don't need to copy everything. I just want to emphasize that. Don't feel like you have to copy everything on the screen, especially if there's a word problem that comes up and you see a long list of words, a sentence or 2 sentences comes up. You don't have to copy all of that. You just need to solve the problem. So like I said, the main thing that you're doing is you're watching that lecture, listening, and solving example problems. Math is best learned by doing. So we do math, and we do that by solving example problems. Typically, they're labeled like A, B, C. Now, it's important to note that my example problems on the Dive lecture, those are different than what Saxon has in the textbook that they also call example problems. They'll be similar because they're covering the same topic, but they're not identical. So you watch the lecture, you take notes, you do these first if you feel like you need extra practice, and you can also do the examples in the Saxon textbook. So to solve an example problem, what you want to do is pause the lecture and solve it in your notes. You have a page that you're taking notes in. You watch and listen, and then you pause that lecture and you try to solve it on your own in your notes on your paper. Learning by doing. If you don't understand something, pause and rewind until you get it, and then try to solve it. Don't copy it. You're not just watching things come up on the screen and just copying as you go and saying, yes, I'm finished. I've got this list of steps written on my paper. I don't know what I just did or what it's connected to or anything. So you want to avoid that. You don't just want to copy these down. You want to listen, pay attention, pause, solve it on your own. Make sure you can get this same answer. Usually the answer is boxed and you can tell where it is. And so this problem, it had a formula with it. You substitute it into the formula the right way, solve it on your own. So summing up for part one, some things to be careful of. Don't read the text before watching the lecture. Most likely you're going to make the connections you need to easier by watching the lecture and just understand things quicker that way. So it's a good time-saving step there. And another thing you want to avoid is looking at the Saxon text during the lecture. So you don't really need it out at all as you're doing the lecture. Your notes, you want to be organized and you don't need to take too many notes. Copy everything that you see. You want to have that title, that subtitle like we showed earlier. You want to do the example problems, write down key ideas, key problem solving tips. Those kinds of things will help you if you need to go back and look at your notes later and you're like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to just substitute right here, or just different things. That writing of key ideas and things, that helps you stay connected and engaged in the lesson without just overdoing your notes either. And finally, remember, my example problems are different than the ones in the Saxon textbook that are titled example problems. John Saxon recommended teaching this way, and we also wanted to do it to give you an extra set of example problems in case you needed that, which you probably won't. Now, after you've watched a lecture, the next step is to complete your facts practice. Look in your tests and worksheets booklet, and in the table of contents, it tells you which facts practice to do with the corresponding lesson that you're doing, and what page in the workbook that facts practice is on. There's a facts practice test to go with every lesson, so you want to do this when you're finished with your lecture. Do these facts practice tests daily, every day that you do a video lecture. Math is deductive, meaning it's rules-based, like baseball or something. So the better you know the rules, the better you're going to play the game. And the facts practice tests, those contain just really fundamental rules, like subtraction facts here. So you put your name here, you start a timer, and start working on your subtraction facts, and you're just going through and figuring those out. Notice how there's a big letter B here. You'll have other facts practice B's as you go along, and so that means you get to try this again, and that's one of the reasons you record the time here, which you want to be 5 minutes or less. That's your goal, is 5 minutes or less on one of these. And of course you want to ace it too. Think about it. If you can be fast and accurate with simple facts like this, when it's time to learn more complex things, new concepts, in other words, it's more likely you'll understand those better and you'll be faster and accurate with them as well. Do these every day, every time you have a lesson. Math 5465 students know that you'll see a lot of these facts again in your higher maths like 7-6 and 8-7, so it's not as much pressure on you to get these down well. But 7-6, 8-7, you really want to get these down good, so when you get to algebra and you're doing basic arithmetic, you're not stuck on basic arithmetic still. I know you want to be fast and accurate, so taking some time to do these facts practice, I know it takes time, but taking that time, it's going to help you be faster and more accurate on your homework in the end. And therefore, overall, you're going to be taking less time to do your daily math. Don't spend more than a couple of seconds on an individual problem. If you don't get it, just move on and keep going. Again, the goal eventually is 5 minutes or less, and all of them right. Now, in part 3 of doing a lesson, we have the lesson practice in the student textbook. The lesson practice, it usually has 5 to 10 problems that provide practice on the concept introduced during the dive lecture. And one big thing that does is helps build mastery on that new concept. So you've watched the lecture, you've done those examples. At the end of that lesson in the Saxon textbook, you'll go there and find that lesson practice section. It'll have that title there, and like this one, you can see it has a couple of parts there. And so what you want to do is about half of those problems. So like you see 8 problems there, A through H. You wouldn't do A through D because there's 2 different sections there. There's an add section and a subtract section. So you do A, and if you do fine on that and you're good, then you can actually stop there. because you've already done a lot of practice. This is just for if you need extra practice. But typically doing like A and B, that should be good. And then go down to subtract and do E and F. Anytime you need to, just rewatch the dive lecture if you feel like you need to go back over that concept. And that's how you know if you really understand it or not, is you're applying the concept you just learned in a slightly new situation. And if you can apply it in that new situation, solve it correctly, great. Now, step 4 out of our 4 steps of completing a lesson, that is to complete the mixed practice section down here. And in the Saxon textbook, again, that's immediately after the section titled Lesson Practice. Now, by mixed, they mean that this section has problems that you'll work from all the previous lessons. And of course, not all in one 30 problem mixed practice, but over time you get practice from all the previous lessons. You see those little numbers in parentheses underneath the problem number? Those are telling you where that type of problem was taught. And John Saxon called that continual review. Some people confuse this with something called the spiral method. It's not the spiral method. And just a little more detail here. What happens there is the first thing, a new bite-sized concept is introduced, and then that new concept is practiced in this mixed practice section. You do that over several lessons. Then you'll have a new lesson and a new dive lecture that'll have another step that's added to that concept. So you practice that in the mixed review for several lessons. Add another new bite-sized concept to that, and so it just builds step by step over time, building fluency. Practicing a concept daily over a long period of time, that's been proven to build long-term retention, and that increases recall speed, makes your homework easier in other words, and it raises exam scores. Learning a new language is often like this as well. You practice for a while. You don't just do verbs for a year and nouns for a year. You do a little bit of everything. It's mixed together. And then you build on that and make it a little more complex. Practice that, make it a little more complex, and so on. So a lot like learning a language or a sport, an instrument, things like that. Now, because it's mixed and covering everything all the time, students will often forget a concept that's in a section, and that's not a big deal. That's part of life. And the important thing is to try to quickly relearn that concept. And so we have highlighted here just an example from a lesson mixed practice, the parentheses again underneath the problem number that tells you what lesson that concept is from. And so if you have forgotten how to do that, then watch the dive lecture for that lesson. Of course, you don't need to watch the whole thing again. Fast forward to a similar example problem. So by seeing a similar problem worked out again, and they listen to that audio explanation, they watch it come up on the digital whiteboard screen, that helps them make the connections that they need and build that long-term retention. And after watching the dive lecture again, the student can usually solve the problem. You want to be careful in this section about, quote, helping your student by showing them how to do the problem correctly. And what you're doing there is just possibly removing that opportunity to build that long-term retention. And that's going to make math harder for them in the end, even though it seems like you're helping them. So if you follow that system efficiently to relearn forgotten concepts, watch that lecture and that part in the lecture again, then students will usually develop fluency better, and that's going to make math faster for them, easier for them in the long run. Now, once you're done with the mixed practice, you'll want to grade that. And parents, what you want to do is get the solutions manual out and just mark incorrect answers. And then for the student, now we have something called the student instruction sheet. You'll want to print this out. It's in the teacher's guide. So make sure you make a note of that, that's where you find the student instruction sheet. And that has some steps in there on correcting, relearning that missed problem. A lot of times all you've done is a careless mistake, and you can correct those easily. But if you can't correct those ones your parents marked with an X, that's when you get the solutions manual out. Study that solution, close that solutions manual back up, and try to solve that problem again now on your own paper. So it's important to solve those problems on your paper, and it's important as you do your mixed practice to show your work. And so this step-by-step solution right there, that's showing your work. Watch me on the lecture how I do the problems, and you'll want to have a similar amount of work shown. You'll know you're showing enough work if you can tell where a mistake is. Now here's some time-saving tips. So first one here, don't get stuck on a problem more than 10 minutes as you're doing your mixed practice. Remember, it's called practice, and think about going to baseball practice. You have that just for a certain amount of time each day. You're going to have baseball practice again another day, so if you don't pick up on a particular concept that day, you'll do it again. So same with math, don't get stuck on a problem more than 10 minutes, and make sure when you are grading your work, or even before that, you don't want that solutions manual out while you're completing your mixed practice set, and you want to follow our student practice instructions. As you're doing your grading and correcting, you want to look at that solution, then close the manual, try to solve it on your own now, and not just copy letter by letter. And parents, again, don't help the student until after all the steps on the student instruction sheet are completed. Remember, you can find that student instruction sheet in the teacher's guide. Now, besides regular lessons, there's also some things called investigations. And a lot of times these are just lessons that have a little more hands-on activities. So like this one, you see you need scissors, an envelope, some activity sheets. So watch the dive lecture that goes with that investigation. Take brief notes. Again, you take notes just like you would a regular lecture. And then after each example problem is taught, pause the lecture, solve the problem on paper yourself. Then if there are a lot of problems in the investigation, we recommend skipping those. Now, about every 5 lessons or so, there is a Saxon test. They're in the back of the Saxon tests and worksheets booklet. Like the mixed practice, they're cumulative and they cover concepts taught from previous lessons, in other words. So the number in parentheses next to each question, you can see the example here, same as with the mixed practice. So again, the student instructions for lessons and tests, you want to take a look at that. There's some instructions on taking your test there. And remember, that's found in the teacher's guide. You want a time limit, set a time limit on these. So again, it's like a mixed practice in its format, but here we want to have a time limit as well, so we add that also. And parental supervision as well during the test. After your test, you want to grade and correct that, and so like the mixed practice, start with the parents just marking incorrect answers. And then students will correct those missed problems. For each missed problem, the student can correct without using any resources, the solutions manual, book notes, parental help, anything like that. Then you can add half credit back to that problem. That's a very standard thing to do. College professors do that. This also encourages the student to show their work, because if they can tell where their mistake is, they can usually correct it. Now, for the remaining problems that you weren't able to correct, then watch the corresponding dive lecture, solve 3 or 4 problems in the lesson practice for that lesson. Now, as you do your math during the week, we don't recommend cramming 1 lesson per day and feeling like you need to get an entire lesson done and all those steps and everything done in 1 day. Instead, work on math a minimum of 4 to 5 days a week, strong math student 4 days, weak or reluctant math student 5 days, and then work on math no more than 30 minutes to an hour per day. 4th, 5th grade level, 30 to 45 minutes, 6th, 7th grade level, 45 minutes to an hour. So that's what we mean by the time method. So again, like baseball practice, like music practice, you have a time limit typically on that practice, and so you just practice as long as you can. Put a good effort in for that 30 minutes to an hour, and then you stop. If after that time the lesson is not completed, that's okay. Just stop. Pick up the next day. We've talked about working fast and accurate. You don't just want to be fast. You don't just want to be accurate. You want to be working on both of those things, and the time method will help you with that. You can read more about that timed method and find the student instructions for the lessons, all those things in the Dive Teacher's Guide. And so that Teacher's Guide, here's an example from Math 8.7, but they're all pretty much the same. There's some setup instructions at the beginning, and now that you're done with that getting started, you'll want to go to that Teacher's Guide, find that. Here's the website right here, the link for that. Download your Teacher's Guide for your course. And that's all for this getting started. God bless, and I hope you have a great year.